Hello and welcome again to another episode of Still Searching with Jed Morris. Today I've got Brandon Beachy. He's a former professional baseball player who has transitioned into franchising, and he's kind of a franchising expert. And I'm excited to have him here because he's going to help explain the difference between franchising and just regular acquisition through entrepreneurship or owning a business in general, as well as some of the opportunities and some of the risks involved for new franchise owners. So if you've ever considered being a franchise owner, this is the episode for you. So Brandon, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jed. I've been looking forward to this for a while.
Yeah, I'm super excited about it because, like I told you before, I know very little about franchising. I know the basics. Kind of the differentiating pieces between franchising and typical, small business ownership that's not franchised. But I'm really excited here because I don't know a whole lot about how normal people really get into franchising. Who's the right person for this type of business model? And I mean, the question I get the most is it safer to go franchise as opposed to buying a non-franchise business? And I always tell people, there's pros and cons to both, but honestly, I don't really know. So I'm excited to have the expert in town.
Yeah. Again, thanks for having me. Yeah, those are all good questions, and just taking it back, I didn't know the answer to any of them. 5, 6 years ago. When I was getting done playing baseball. All I knew about franchising was, Papa John's, Taco Bell, McDonald's. I knew fast food.
Yeah.
That's all I associated with it. And I thought you had to, have millions of dollars to invest in them, to have several, because the margins are super thin, and it's more of a, you've already got to be rich to get rich in franchising kind of play.
Yeah, we hear about Shaq, and he's like, oh, okay, well, he made all that money, and now he just bought a bunch of franchises to distribute his portfolio of wealth, so to speak.
Yeah. And to answer one of the questions you rattled off there was who is this for? That's a viable answer. If you're someone with an ultra high net worth, adding these portfolio businesses in a franchise setting is a little safer than just investing in a bunch of startups and smaller businesses. So that's absolutely a viable route, and one of the reasons that it exists. But that's a small percentage, I think, of franchisees that make up the whole of the industry.
All right, well, we're going to dive into it, but before we do, a lot of people aren't familiar with you, so why don't you give us a little bit of your background and kind of what you've been through, and a little bit of how you got into franchising.
Yeah. So I grew up in Indiana. Played sports. Was pretty good, not awesome, and but I got an opportunity to go to play college baseball and get my school paid for at a little Christian school near me called Indiana Wesleyan University. It was great. I interned with the prosecutor's office, was studying criminal justice and pre-law, always kind of going back to watching Matlock with my mom and Law and Order. I wanted to be a lawyer. And then after my junior year, I went and played in a college summer league, and I had a scout randomly show up and see me throw an inning, and told me he wanted to sign me. Came back the next night, threw one more, and shook his hand, and off I went to join the Atlanta Braves minor leagues. And a couple years later, I got called up to the big leagues, and quickly.
But you make it sound like you weren't actually trying to get into the big leagues. Like this just kind of happened by accident.
It was by accident. It was always a dream, but it was never. I was not nearly good enough to have it be like a plan or anything. Yeah. And then not until it happened. Honestly, not until I was there. And then once I was there, it was about staying. And then I was having success and got good. And then I blew out my elbow. And then came back a little over a year later, blew it out again. And then, I had been good enough at this point that I got a couple one-year deals with the Dodgers, but, I hurt my elbow again. And then I knew my body was done. I knew it was over. And I spent 3 more years having another surgery, doing rehab, a couple minor league, independent ball things, purely because I was scared of what was next. We just had our second child. And I'm, riding the bus around the country with a bunch of 22-year-olds in the minor leagues, sitting here in my 30s. And I'm like, I can't do this anymore. What am I doing? So then, I went through MLB's transition program. Somebody helped me, take the 45 seconds to write out a resume because there was nothing to put on it. And I sat down, and this is something I help people do now is I sat down with my wife. What do we want our life to look like? And who has that life? And I started reaching out to them, getting coffee, lunch, whatever. And pretty quickly, I figured out that I wanted to control my time. That's something that I desired that these people had, and they were all entrepreneurial as well. And that's how they afforded to have that time and not miss their kids' events and those kinds of things. That's something, had I stayed in baseball, I would have still been traveling and been away from my family. That's not what I wanted to do. But I didn't have any ideas or experience, obviously. So hanging out with a friend of mine around this time, talking about things, he said, "Hey, you should talk to this guy I spoke to a couple of years ago. I looked at some franchises. Sounds like it might be something you want to look into." And again, at this time, like, he told me that, and I was like, "Well, I can't afford to buy a McDonald's. Everybody wants to open a Chick-fil-A, but I don't think I can, do these things." But I took that phone call with the guy, and I realized a couple things right away. I realized, hey, this actually makes sense. There's a lot more than I thought. Just going off on a tangent. It's like if you go drive down the highway, 3/4 of the wrapped trucks and fitness, beauty, anything you go do or see out there on the road, 3/4 of them are probably franchises. And we just don't know, from your kid's education to your, who cuts your pet's hair and washes them, to, I mean, anything you're doing health and beauty wise. Anybody that's coming and giving you a quote on anything inside or outside your home, these are all franchised. But
there's a couple things you mentioned there that I want to touch on real fast, because you said, when you realized that the baseball was no longer the option for you. It's funny the way you're describing it. It parallels really well to military members. A lot of the ones that I know that transition through, and it's not that they are not talented or skilled or have experience. It's that, you're just scared. You're scared of what life is like on the other side. You've been in an environment for so long that it's like, it's not that you don't believe you can succeed. You've almost forgotten what opportunities are out there, and you're really worried about, like, hey, what is there? Is it anything I can do? Am I going to be able to be successful? And the most important step that I usually tell transitioning veterans, which is what you and your wife did, was like sit down and think, hey, regardless of the job or the career, what do we want our lives to look like? That's a huge piece, like, that most people don't do. They're just, obviously, because we're scared, we're nervous, and so we just jump at the first, paid opportunity. But taking the time to think about, like, hey, where do we want to live? What do we want our days to look like? And then that kind of led you naturally down the road and say, hey, entrepreneurship, maybe franchising. And you took a chance on a phone call that you probably wouldn't have done otherwise. So that's really great. That's really good job of, like, recognizing growth potential.
That's exactly right. And then, on that phone call, I realized a few things. I realized, hey, even though I couldn't write these things down on my resume, I do have a lot of qualities that I believe will translate. I've been a teammate my whole life. I can be a teammate. I can lead people with servant leadership and be reliable for them. I have the drive and that self-starter inner motivation that it's going to take. And I definitely have resiliency. All I've done is, getting lost constantly, with a few wins mixed in sports, but it's a lot of losing and managing that. And I think that translates well to business. So I realized I had these things, and it just made sense theoretically. Well, if I find the right vehicle, for me, that has the guide rails and support, I can fuel it with these qualities that I possess. And it's a way where I can bet on myself. And again, because that's what I had done through my baseball career, was just betting on myself, and hopefully be able to provide and achieve the things that I want to do.
That is
And
that is
yeah,
so good. Find the right vehicle, like assessing where your strengths and weaknesses are, and then you're like, hey, there's a lot of different paths, a lot of different vehicles. Find the one that's right for me that I know that I can fuel. That is going to be my best chance for success. It's going to get me to the destination that we've already decided on is where we want to be anyway.
that's right.
Okay.
And that's the order you have to do it in. You have to figure out where you're trying to get, what's your destination, and then you have to figure out what is, what your fuel is, and what kind of vehicle that fuel applies to and works with. And I think jumping way ahead in this conversation, I think where it goes wrong, I think a lot of people, they choose a vehicle because it's shiny or pretty or cool, and not necessarily because of where it's going to take them or what kind of fuel you're using to make it run.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. And we see it all over the social media today. Go buy a business. It's a shiny vehicle that'll take you straight from 9-to-5 job of poverty to wealth and not having to work in the business. So yeah, we'll definitely touch on some of that. All right, so you discover franchising, you discover that it's more than just buying a McDonald's, or if you're that lucky individual, maybe a Chick-fil-A. So what about franchising really spoke to you, and then how did you end up tangibly moving into it and seeing some success or even some failure?
Yeah, so I worked with this consultant who's a colleague and friend of mine to this day, and he helped me kind of go through and figure out, and that's something I like doing now. So I got into the consultant side. This is jumping ahead, because on that phone call I realized, well, hey, why didn't someone in baseball tell me about this? And I said, well, hey, first I'm going to do it. I'm going to be successful at it and do it well. And then I'm going to bridge that gap. I'm going to be that resource for other guys that were in my shoes, to do that. And so he took me through the process of kind of figuring out what I wanted, what skills did I have, what were my likes and dislikes. And as someone that hadn't been in the corporate world or anywhere other than a baseball field, I didn't know on a lot of them. I just didn't know what kind of employees I wanted to work with, what kind of structures or setups or anything like that, whether my marketing was a strength or weakness, for instance. So a lot of it was like, hey, I'm going to trust you. I'm going to look at these things and I'm going to learn. So that's what I did. I went through and I looked at 3 or 4 brands and went through their process with them, and then ultimately kind of hit pause for a little bit and came back a few months later and said, hey, let's look at this. I think I've learned these things about myself. And for me, that was service. I wanted a service industry business. And that's, it really spoke to me as my first business, as, something I wanted to grow to be a primary source of income. I wanted kind of the uncapped potential to scale, as opposed to having a brick and mortar that I needed to spend more to build out the first one. And then once I get that up and running, I got to reinvest in a significant way to build out a second one and a third one.
Yeah.
So it just made more sense to me at that time. Hey, I can just buy another F-250 and hire 2 more guys, if the sales dictate it. So that's what I was looking at. And ultimately, Koala Insulation is a franchise that I chose. It was new. It was pretty new at the time. I was an early adopter. I got the whole Nashville market, and it's worked out. I jumped all in. I worked it really hard for a little over a year, where I was in it every single day. I wasn't installing it or selling it in homes. I did both of those things, but neither of those were my primary roles. But at about that year plus mark, I was able to hire another manager, hire someone to answer the phones full time, and kind of scale myself back from the day to day of that business.
All right. So that's your first franchise. And what was the name of it again?
Koala Insulation.
Koala Installation. So for those of us who, like myself, who have never acquired a franchise before, what was that process like of actually buying the franchise?
Yeah. So going through, going all the way back to when I'm introduced to them, I'm going through and getting on a call with them, and I'm going over, well, here's our brand. Here's the 10,000-foot view. Here's what we do. Then, you go through another call where they kind of, well, here's our FDD, which is franchise disclosure document. Here's the numbers. Here's the initial investment. Here's the return that we're seeing from our existing locations. And then I went through validation. That's where you get to talk to some existing franchisees. Say, hey, you've got your pro forma at this point. I'm plugging things in for what I want to do. And now I'm talking to existing franchisees about what they're actually seeing, whether, that FDD, the brand is limited to the FDD. They can't tell you anything that's not represented in there. It's super regulated by the FTC. So to get the real scoop, you got to talk to the real franchisees too.
And so that's really the key. It's you have to do your due diligence ahead of time, but you have to go out there and find, franchisees who are actually working it and have those conversations. Be like, hey, honestly, what is this really like?
Yeah. For me, that whole process, the discovery process, is about painting a picture of you in that business. And you need a lot of data points to get the more information you get, the clearer that picture gets. And you can, once it gets clear, you can decide whether you like what you see or not. But you got to make that picture clear, or you're just going in blind. So for me, I did that. I was talking to franchisees. We mapped out territory.
Now that territory mapping, that's pretty common with franchises. You'll distinguish how much space is like your space, so another franchise doesn't get that piece.
That's right. So it'll be different, depending on the model. If you're talking like a brick and mortar model, a fitness brand or a food brand, they might go with mileage, right? They might drop a dot on the map and say you get a 5-mile radius of this. This is protected. No one else can move in, and we're not going to cannibalize each other here. Whereas at a service brand, it might be, just pure population. Hey, we might split up these zip codes to be around 250,000 people. It might be, they might go households. There's a bunch of different metrics that different brands will use, but you're going to have some sort of protected territory. So I went through that process, and basically carved out all of Nashville. It just, at that time, not right or wrong. It made sense to me, like, hey, this is my thing. I'm going to jump all in. I'd rather have the whole area protected, where I'm not, at the mercy, if you will, of somebody else who I don't know starting a business whose name and performance might affect mine.
Well, that makes sense.
That was my thinking.
You're in a major city in the region, and perhaps it's because you bought into a franchise that was relatively new, but you had the opportunity to kind of block off that whole metro area and say, hey, I'm taking a bet, not just on me and this franchise, but this whole metro area. There's, I'm not sure what the population of Nashville is, but there's definitely more than 1 or 2 million people. So you're saying, hey, in this area, like, if I can just get like 0.5% of these people to call up and become a customer, I'll be doing just fine.
Yes, that was my line of thinking. Again, and that's not right or wrong. It definitely varies based on who it is and what they're trying to accomplish, and the market and the business model. I mean, a million different factors. I want to make that clear. The way I did things or do things is not right for everybody, and I definitely don't try to push that, if you will. But then ultimately, I went through all the calls with the team, the operations, the founder, and then I went to what they call discovery day, confirmation day, and that's where you fly out, to spend a couple of days at their headquarters, meeting their team face to face. And and I advise people on this now. For me, that's the 1 yard line. I like everything about this. I'm not really going there to learn anything new. I'm going there to shake their hand and look them in the eye and see if I get a good feeling. Are these people that I want to be in business with? Are these the people that I see as partners to me? Because that's what you want. And honestly, they're doing the same thing, because for them, especially, a newer brand at the time, they would want to be selective. They'd be smart to be selective, right? Because they're going to sell a whole lot more territories in the next 5 years if those first 50 crush it. and have great businesses and are
Yeah.
telling everybody else how great those businesses are. So,
Yeah,
so
your
the more
performance is
selective they can.
directly going to impact that FDD. And so
That's right.
the next franchise buyer and so on and so forth, they're going to look at that and they're going to, your performance can be involved in that. And they're going to think, is this worth my time? So yeah, it's an investment on your end, but it's also an investment on headquarters and on the actual franchisor to make sure that they're picking quality owners that they believe can actually be successful in those areas.
Yeah, and the better the franchisor, the more picky they are. I believe it. I think you can look up franchising go wrong, and usually there's a trend of just if you've got a bank account that can meet our minimum requirements and you can physically sign this dotted line, we'll take it. And I think that's short-sighted and doesn't usually go well.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm completely out of the space, so this is just the impressions I get through the rumor mill. But to me, looking from the outside in, it feels like anybody with a couple bucks can buy a Subway, but almost nobody can buy a Chick-fil-A. Like you have to wait in line, you have to pay a ton of money, you have to agree to like work there for like 60 hours a week, and maybe sign away the rights to your firstborn child. I don't know. Like everybody's like trying to trip up themselves to get into a Chick-fil-A.
Yeah, that's accurate. I mean, I don't know about the firstborn, but no, it's true, and that's why that's part of why they are so successful, is they are so selective, and they really forcibly make sure you're upholding their high level of customer service and all that they do, and they're the gold standard for sure.
All right, so from just a tactical perspective, you do your diligence on different types of franchises. You find one that you're interested in. You're looking at their data, you're looking at their FDD, you're looking at their performance. Things kind of check out. So then you reach out to owners. Those conversations go well. Then you finally have this 1 yard line meeting with the headquarters. Everybody gets the warm fuzzies. And then from you, and everyone signs off. So at that point, it just comes down to you making your franchise fee, signing on the dotted line, and then just getting going, right?
Yeah, that's right. You have a signing call, make that bank transfer that's awfully painful with any large purchase, where you sign those over, and then you hit the onboarding process. And for a service business like this, it's about 90 days or so. Getting you up to speed on all the softwares that they use, and that is part of the it's a transaction where I'm paying franchise fees and upfront cost. And in my view, what I'm getting for that is my time. So I'm, could I have started an insulation business with zero knowledge on my own? Yeah, I could have. Now, it would have taken me years to get where I got in 2 months, I think. I've got as soon as I sign, I've got a website built for me and launched in my market. All the softwares, having vendors for bookkeeping, marketing, all those things, just recommended and there, and making it really easy. And some things, with franchises, they can be awesome. Sometimes they don't work out so great, but still, just having it there as a first time business owner was super helpful. So I went through that onboarding process, and then went to training. Did a full week of training down at headquarters, and then came back and we launched. We're turning on the marketing. We're got a Google presence. We're going after, being a home service business, we kind of go after the breadcrumbs. You go after the Angie's List, Home Advisor, those kinds of home service leads. And you really, figure things out for a couple of months, kind of struggle through. And for me personally, during that time, I was on the phone all day, every day. If it wasn't with a customer, most of the time it was with other franchisees, with other people in the industry, where I'm, how quickly can I become an expert in this business, in attic insulation, something I'd never thought about in my life until a few months before. So that's what I did.
So you're referring to one of the things that I see, and that a lot of people kind of see when they're walking into a franchise situation, which is, like you said, especially if you're coming into an industry where you have no experience and everything is brand new, You could on your own decide, I'm going to open an attic installation service business. And then you could spend time getting in the industry, learning everything there is to know about how you could physically yourself install that installation, the vendors to work with, the suppliers, all the software, all the things that go into building out that business. But the difference with a franchise is that, yes, while you have to play by their rules, they're giving you the playbook. And so,
Yeah.
like right from the beginning, they're telling you, here's your website, here's your SEO. We're going to help set you up to be able to, so customers can find you. And then here's the vendors you work with, here's your suppliers, here's your pricing. Like they give you all of it. And it's more on you to just learn the playbook, which must have felt really good coming from a sports background, as opposed to like, hey, how can I figure this all out on my own? I can just figure out what, like you said, they compiled 2 years of knowledge for you. And yeah, you have to do it their way, but I mean, you're getting 90% of the way there of learning how to do it at all.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot like what I would imagine a military operation briefing would be. Like, here, we're going to walk through here, and you go out and execute. But we're telling you, there's variables, obviously. There's going to be things that we haven't thought of, or that, issues that come up. But for the most part, like you said, you're 90% there. It's just about execution. Yeah, so that's what I did, and just grew over time, and things snowballed. And then, like I said, I hired some other people. I was franchisee of the year in my first full year, really my second year in business.
Hey, congratulations.
Thank you. And then that's kind of when I was like, hey, I've got things to this point. I can take a step back. And I went through training with this group called FranChoice on how to help other people kind of look at this. And that's
so when you bought the franchise, all you did was buy the actual franchise, the legal right. So when you started, it was just you. And so that's what you're talking about, how you're learning the software, you're on the phones, it's just you. And then you start off by like hiring one other person to work with you. And then after the first year, you've built that into being able to hire a manager. Now you've got a team, and now this thing is running, and you can step back a little bit and be more like the franchise operator as opposed to the implementer.
That's right. So and it's all strategy, right? Because you're gonna, if you're looking at franchise brands, they're gonna tell you, well, yeah, it's possible to do it this way, it's possible to do it that way. But what they can't tell you, because it's not in the FDD, and they have to stick to that, is what's it going to cost you to do it, path A or path B or path C. Yeah, if you're an owner operator, you can look at that item 7 and you can assume that that's going to be pretty clear. If you want to hire a salesperson or somebody else from the start, because that's what you need to do for what you're trying to accomplish, you got to build all those things in. So I had the foresight. I started with an operations manager and a sales guy, and then we hired two crew members. Fired the sales guy within about 2 weeks. We didn't need him, and my operations manager came from a sales background, and that was kind of the plan. Okay, I'll hire you for both of these, but I want you to learn the operations so you can be the GM one day. And it just happened a little quicker than we thought. And then I hired someone else to do the operations about a year in. So I had that plan from the start to build that infrastructure, and it worked out well. I've got some great people. I've been very fortunate in that, and that's a key to any small business, that you don't want to be, in it completely, obviously.
Yeah, you hit it right on the head too, because with small business, a lot of people look at it and they're thinking, hey, how can I work on the business and not in the business? And especially with all the fervor we see online, you see a lot of people thinking, hey, I can buy a business and then how do I not be actively involved in that business? And I think what a lot of people who have not bought a business don't realize is that it's the goal of almost every business for the owner not to be involved in the business. that's what we're all looking for. The difference though is that you have to, and that's what builds value in the business. You're building a tangible asset. But the difference is that you have to build those systems in place, people systems and physical systems and technology systems and sales systems, so that the asset can run without you as the owner physically in the building or on the sales calls. That's super important. And one of the great things with a franchise is it gets you, like we said, a lot of those systems right out the door.
Yeah, there should be a path. Like whatever you're looking to accomplish, you should be have a fairly high level of confidence that you're going to be able to do that if you follow the playbook. That's the whole reason to look at a franchise. And going back to one of the original questions you rattled off, is the success rate higher? Yeah, it is. Doesn't guarantee success. But I mean, if you think about it, what is it? 90% of businesses fail before the 24-month mark or whatever it is. Well, the idea is, well, here's a business that already made it well beyond that. And that's why they started franchise. So you have the playbook of someone who has been successful, and it's about implementing. Now, yeah, there's a lot of other variables that can go into, and franchises aren't perfect. It's still going to look like a bell. You're still going to have a top third that's crushing it, a middle third doing okay, and you're still going to have a bottom third. Now it's about figuring out, well, hey, why is this person in the bottom third as opposed to the top third? What are we doing? What's causing that? And I'll be the first person to tell you that 95+% of the time it's the operator. It is. And I mean, I think that's, franchises or not, that's pretty true of any business.
Yeah, like with so many things, it really does fall on the operator / the owner. Take a quick pause. There you go. Got started, had the dog in here with me. He's just like, starts whining. Poor guy.
It's all right. I forgot today was a holiday, so the kids are home. So I half expect to be interrupted at some point.
I know. I was thinking over here, like, inauguration day is a holiday now. And it's like, oh, right. I'm okay. That gotcha. Okay. Yeah. I'm up to speed.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, hey, thanks for walking me through your first year as an operator, as a franchisee. And it sounds like things went really well for you. And I'm really grateful that you broke down how, yes, it went well for you. Yes, you planned it. But at the same time, that doesn't mean it goes well for everyone. And sometimes, there's a lot of factors there. It's buying into the right franchise, like making sure you've got the right support. A lot of it comes down to the operator. Can you execute the playbook? Maybe it's the right franchise, but maybe it's not the right franchise for you. It's not the playbook, like we said, the vehicle that you can fuel and drive. And so there's a lot of factors that go into there. But it's very interesting, especially for somebody like myself. I've never considered buying a franchise, but hearing the way you describe it, I'm like, wow, that really does make a lot of sense, for a lot of people. Especially as I think of a lot of veterans that I've had this exact conversation with, and I don't know what to tell them because I don't have the expertise with franchises. But they'll say, is it safer, to have a franchise? I'm like, I think statistically it is safer. I think the numbers bear that out. But at the end of the day, it's really about, can you execute the playbook of the franchise? It's not so much, whether or not you can protect your downside. And I think, like we said before, if you're new to an industry, there's something great about having a franchise where they hand you the playbook and you just have to feel confident and comfortable that you can execute as the operator. And maybe you get that kind of success that you saw after that first year. Maybe it takes 3, 5, or, it just kind of depends on how it goes for you. But at least you're kind of starting you off on third base, pun intended.
That's exactly right. And there's no guarantees in life, and it's a bet. You're making a bet on yourself, and the intuitive, or what's on the table with a bet is you can lose a bet. But it's figuring out, I harp on fit. It's fit is going to be everything when it comes to finding the right franchise. And it's not as easy to figure out on your own what that fit is, because you got to, I think a lot of, I call it consumer lenses. We all view things and businesses from our consumer lens. And what I mean by that is, I think it goes poorly more often than not when you buy a business or a franchise based on, oh, I like cookies, let's buy a cookie business. Or you know what I'm talking about? I'm a fitness freak. I love fitness. So I'm gonna get this boutique fitness. Yeah. Like that doesn't, what you as a business owner, the fit of you running that business, a lot of times has nothing to do with whether you are a customer for that product. Right. Or knowing what you're going to have to do to put into it, and I think some of the dirty words that I don't like in franchising that I see take, cause people to go astray is, semi-absentee executive
Yeah.
model. And those exist, right? Those exist, going back to, the Shaq example. Somebody, some C-suite executive with a high net worth that wants to diversify into some businesses. You get a brick and mortar. Brick and mortars are a lot easier to do that, but it's still a business. If you're doing that and you don't have enough businesses to have a whole team that's running them for you, then it's going to be you. I like to use the analogy of a nanny. You could hire a nanny to raise your kids, to be there 9 to 5 every day. They're still your kids. You still have to raise them. She's not going to do it for you. Just like a manager with your business. They're
Especially
not going
if she calls in sick one day. Then what?
Yeah, exactly. So it's, especially in service businesses, I think it's just a horrible idea to, from the start, say, you know what, I'm going to keep my day job. And I think I can, you see it all the time. Oh yeah, just find a GM for $50K a year and, everything's good.
See, now you're speaking my language, because, half of all the comments I see are people saying, buy a small business for passive income, buy a small business, hire a GM for $60,000 a year to run it for you. Just all of this ridiculousness that anyone who's actually operated a small business would tell you is total bullshit. But you see it nonetheless, right? And
Yeah.
This brings up a question of risk, because what you just described is something that I tell a lot of people who are interested in, buying a small business, usually through the SBA program. And, I tell them, like, look, if you buy that way, you're the owner operator. You've signed a personal guarantee, you have X millions of dollars of debt, and you're the only one responsible for that. So like you probably don't have the cash flow to hire a GM, but even if you did, that GM does not have the risk of failure of that business on them. You do. And so if they take time off, if they, have some sort of home situation that they have to deal with, or if they find another job, then it's still you stepping in. And you can't incentivize that person effectively with equity, because there's no amount of growth that offsets the amount of debt that the business has taken on. And so this is a risk calculation that you have to make. And the very first risk question that has been very popular, I'd love to get your feedback on, is when you bought your franchise, you paid the franchise fee, you're in the franchise. Did you have to sign any kind of personal guarantee? Like what was the debt situation, or what was the obligation to keep you in there? And I'm really interested in hearing that, because that's in direct opposition to like the SBA program that requires you to sign a personal guarantee. And these are the two ways that, most first-time buyers at least get into the market of becoming a business owner.
Similar. And I would say that most franchises, you use the SBA, system. So they're funded that way. So that's a misconception I had too, was, oh, I like using Shaq because it's somebody everybody knows. You got to be Shaq, you got to be able to buy 20 of these things, and who has that kind of money? Well, I assume people are paying for these businesses in cash. And no, most people are using, SBA. There's 401k rollovers, called ROBs. There's, home equity lines of credit.
So that's what I assumed. I assumed people were using like, home equity lines of credit, or taking out like, any personal savings, or like a 401k and funding a franchise fee. But those franchise fees can be pretty large. So it does make sense that, what you're saying is a lot of people actually still use the SBA 7A program to buy their franchise fee.
I would say that the vast majority, you utilize that program, because, if you're putting 20% down, usually that will cover, if we're talking about a service-based business, usually your franchise fee, you pay that in cash, that's your 20% deposit. So they'll fund the rest of it to buy your equipment and everything else with, some of the, if you're building out a 7,000 square foot facility, you're going to need more cash, obviously, to get that 20%, but SBA will still work with that. So the SBA is very, very tied into the franchising world for sure. But then on top of that personal guarantee, there's a franchise agreement, and those agreements are usually, 10 years. I would say, there's obviously exceptions, but just, around 10 years. So what that entails is, some kind of obligation. Again, there's going to be an obligation there. So you can't just say, hey, 3 months in, this is hard. Okay. Yeah. You've signed a 10-year agreement, just like with the SBA. You can't, back out. You have to pay off what you owe. And with that agreement, there's a route to get out, but it's usually not for free, right? And then, with that 10-year agreement, there's going to be a renewal. A lot of people renew at the end of that if it's going well, obviously. But that's what it looks like. So it's a
Okay.
contract. It's an obligation.
Yeah. Okay, so that actually makes a lot more sense. So it's not a different route from SBA. It's actually most of the franchisees use SBA to buy their franchises. And then the other
Yeah.
piece of that is on top of the normal SBA personal guarantee process, there's going to be a franchise agreement where you have an agreement with the franchisor to be a franchisee for an X amount of time. And in your case, it was 10 years. And so if you decide that like, what's the situation if I decide that like, not 3 months because that's insane, but yeah, I get your point.
Yeah.
But say it's like 5, 6 years and I'm like, look, the franchise is going well. I just don't want to do it anymore. Can I buy myself out? Can I sell my franchise to somebody else? I assume I would need franchisor approval. I mean, what's that process look like?
Yeah. So you can sell it. I mean, that's obviously, thinking about exit on the way in is something you need to be aware of. It's part of the whole picture of what you want to do with this business. But yeah, typically, there will be some kind of transfer fee, $5,000-$10,000 of a transfer fee. That's not a revenue generating thing for the franchisor. That's, hey, we got to cover transferring, the lawyers to move all these contracts around and get that contract assigned to the right person. And then, there is going to be an approval process. They're always going to reserve the right to say, hey, we're going to make them come out and meet us too, and we're going to have to sign off that we want them in the system.
That makes sense.
So they're going to reserve some protection there. Not real common that they're denying people on those transfers, but I'm sure it happens, and probably for good reason. Again, whoever's buying it is going to have to meet their standards. So every franchise is going to have a minimum net worth and minimum liquid requirement. Some of them high, some of them a lot lower than you would think. But they're going to again, that's to safeguard themselves from failures in the system to some extent.
Well, with that in mind, I guess the next obvious question is, what are the most common exit strategies for franchisees? I mean, obviously, like with any small business, there are going to be people who buy and they want to run it for life. They're going to run it for 10, 15, 20 years or however long the franchisor will allow. But what kind of exits are most common and what kind of exits do people look at?
Yeah, again, it's anything and everything. There's people that get into it that said, hey, I want to get this up, get it cash flowing and flip it. Other people are like, hey, this is a 10-year agreement. I want to get these things up, get them moving, and I'm going to sell it between years 5 and 7. And then I'm going to take that and I'm going to roll it over in a new business and more franchise. Then you get it up and you get some empire builders that say, hey, I'm gonna get this thing going, get it good, and then I'm going to acquire my neighbor. And then I'm going to start another one over in this city. And then, they go from one franchise to having 50 of them, over time. They can, because once they get it, and that's kind of the beauty of franchising is once you got it down and you're able to do it well, you know how to run these things. So if someone's struggling, for one reason or another, those people are usually pretty confident they can come in and acquire it for relatively, cheap compared to what they expect to do. And then there's people that, like you said, like, hey, I want a business that I can have my kids turn over to my kids someday. So I don't have an exit strategy. I have a lifetime kind of strategy. So it's anything in between, and all of those things are done, extremely commonly in franchises.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like, I mean, what you said there about understanding the playbook, that makes total sense. Like if you buy into a franchise and you get really good at your location and you really get really good at executing on that playbook, then it almost doesn't matter where you're at because the only thing that changes is the market. And as long as you understand the market you're moving into, then the playbook remains the same. And you can just rinse and repeat over and over and over. So that makes a lot of sense. And hearing you describe it, I think I've come to the realization that operating a franchise is basically the same as operating any other small business. You're using it as an SBA for an acquisition cost. You're taking on a personal guarantee. You're an owner operator on day one. We all have the goal of building it into a profitable business, hopefully where we're not working 80 hours a week. The only real difference is that you have a franchise agreement, is that you've got a playbook from the franchisor that you're going to implement. And based on the implementation of that franchise agreement and your agreement to operate it for a certain amount of time, it's exactly the same as any other business.
Yeah. So, which begs the question, why spend the money on a franchise as opposed to doing it yourself? Well, for me, my answer is always, you're buying your time. I'm paying that franchise fee and I'm paying those ongoing royalties for that time up front, for that ring, and the support, whatever it may be. I just to use marketing again as an example, I know nothing about marketing. Well, look, this brand, they do all the lead gen in-house. That's what they're telling me. I talked to 6 franchisees. They all say it's going great. It's perfect. Well, that fits with what I'm looking for. That's something I can't get in an independent business. And then, the power of a system. I think every franchisee wants to buy into a system. Look at McDonald's, the name brand, the recognition. You can't get that opening, Jed's Burgers. And there's advantages there. And then, the weight of the system. You got, Floor Coverings International. Been doing flooring for, it seems like forever. They're white labeling and sourcing materials that you couldn't do with Jed's Floor, because they're purchasing so much. So there's advantages to be in there.
That's a really good point because, it's obvious when we see the name brand. I've never stopped at a McDonald's or a Chick-fil-A and thought, I wonder who owns this. It's just what it is, right? It's the brand. But obviously, the vast majority of those are franchised out. But you made a really good point right there that it's on the supply side. So when you own a small business, you need all the supplies to actually, implement the service that you're providing. And when you're at scale in a franchise, you have access to cost reductions and supplies that a normal small business would not have. And you've got access to credit and relationships that a small business would not have. And certainly there's plenty of startup hurdles that you have as a small business, but I mean, lead generation is huge. I can't tell you how many times I've met with hundreds of small business owners over the last few years, looking at different businesses to acquire. And I think one of the most common things you see on a sim, on their sales page is just, we don't do any marketing. It's all referrals. Like none of us know how to do Facebook ads. Maybe we've got a Google listing, and it's just all that stuff that is inherently important to running a business. You don't really have to think about that because it's kind of handled for you.
Yeah, well, I mean, some brands do more of that than others, and that's the validation part of the process is the most important part, where you're talking to the franchisees, because the franchise will tell you everything you want to hear, right? I mean, the good ones again are vetting people, but they obviously are trying to sell franchises, and that they will make claims, and it's your job in that due diligence to figure out what's real and finding out, like, hey, they're telling me about this call center that's handling and all my scheduling. Is it effective? Would you rather they didn't? Those kinds of things, because that happens, where it sounds good, it sounds perfect. That they're handing you a business in a box, but they're fumbling. It's just not. It's not great. So you've got to get the validation from existing franchisees to find out what it really is. Is it what they said?
Really well said. And that's a great pivot too, because now we've seen all the positives of having a franchise, but there's obviously going to be some negatives there. One of them being that you can't go outside the playbook. Like how much flexibility do you have as a franchisee to, I guess, move outside the playbook when you see an opportunity, or if you see an inefficiency or something like that? Do you have to get approval from the franchisor every time you want to do something? Like obviously every franchise is going to have different rules about this, but talk to me a little bit about the kind of flexibility you have as an owner.
Yeah, it's going to vary wildly again, and I, you can put that answer on repeat for a lot of these things. But, for example, again, McDonald's, very little. Like you're going to do what McDonald's does. They're handling the national ad campaigns, the sales, all of that. Like you are there to just execute that playbook and nothing more. You get into
make sure the burgers are made.
Yeah. If you get into a new upcoming service-based franchise like I did, there's a whole lot of freedom, going out and creating new partnerships, trying, new ancillary services, other things like that. There's a whole lot of freedom. And that honestly attracted me. I've been coached my whole life. I've been told what to do and when to be there. And I wanted the ability to have a little bit of that freedom to innovate along. I get the playbook, I get these things, but also I'm getting a partner that is willing to learn too. And I've seen that in my franchise system over and over again. And every franchise is going to do that. Is they're going to take the wins of their franchisees and take them to the whole system, and they'll implement. So that and they're learning from each other. And just jumping ahead there, like that, I think part of that trade-off where I'm paying that franchise fee and those royalties, it should be every franchisee's goal to get to a point where you're no longer relying or depending on, where it's like, I made my benefit up front, not really benefiting anymore at this point. But that was the transaction. I paid it all. And even though I don't need it now, I still have to pay that royalty. But because what's going to happen is your greatest asset as a franchisee is going to be the other franchisees. And it's not a bad thing. You should want to get to that point. You should want it. Hey, I bought my time. That's what I did up front. It's there. The support is there on the equipment, on these other things. But really, in my day-to-day, my greatest asset is the other franchisees who are trying other things, who are helping me avoid, I've wasted a ton of money on marketing. I paid, did a 13-month billboard deal a couple times over, and one of them, I got 2 calls in 13 months, and they were both from other marketing companies saying, "Hey, are you dumb enough
we
to
can help you with your
pay
billboard
with us too?" Yeah. So it's, telling other franchisees, "Hey, this didn't perform at all. Save your money." Being able to help other people and them helping me. It's been the greatest asset of being a franchisee.
Brandon, that is so good. That is so good because, like we said at the beginning, you mark off your territory. And so franchisees aren't crisscrossing over each other. So you're not competing with each other. In fact, you're a team. You're all collaborating together. So you're growing yours. They're all growing theirs. You have other owners who are literally experiencing the exact same thing that you're experiencing. And maybe they're a little bit ahead of you. And then as you grow, there's going to be newer owners who are a little bit behind you. And you all get to test different things in different markets. And the best practices rise to the top. And that's a huge advantage over being a typical small business owner because, being one myself, like it's a very, very lonely job. Like, you don't have peers to reach out to. And even if you are proactive, and I absolutely advocate for small business owners to be proactive and network with other small business owners, not just to learn about wins and losses and share, war stories and notes, but also because you just need some community because it is very lonely. But at the same time, you get this opportunity to learn from each other, to figure out like what's working, what's not working. That's something that a typical small business owner doesn't get to do. They have to figure it all out on their own. And they have nobody else who's like just a little bit ahead of them. And even if you are a small business owner and you have other business owners who are friends, they're not in your industry. They're not in your market.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have your systems. Everything is different. So, maybe this Facebook ad campaign worked for them, but that doesn't mean it's going to work for you because they have a sprinkler company and you have a HVAC company. It's completely different.
That's right.
So you found that the community of franchisees is actually pretty robust. And obviously that's going to differ based on the franchise. But if you get into a good one, the owners are all there working together, all trying to be successful because your success is inherently my success because then we get to test things and be better.
That's right. That's exactly right. And it's man,
are you selling on franchises right today? What's happening?
Well, I am one, right? I'm still in it. And, I've gotten mine to where the majority of the time that I spend on my business is talking to other franchisees. I'm running my meetings. I'm in touch with my managers, and I've got my thumb on the pulse of everything. But we've got group chats and email chains and all that stuff with best practices and innovations that really, that networking between franchisees is where I spend a lot of my time. It's something coming from sports that I really identified with, and it's pure, right? It's to the point where the more they grow, the better I get. If it comes to distribution channels, like the bigger we get, if we're buying 200 million in materials, our price is going to go down, as opposed to, so the more they spend, the better it is for me. The more they do, the better the system does, the better my multiple will be when I go to exit.
Yep.
All of it. It's all tied together. So it's truly, a situation where, you want all boats to rise.
To me, it really does sound like, obviously, if you're interested in this space, you have to find the right franchise vehicle that's the right fit for you, obviously. But in a lot of ways, one of the most important things is buying into the right ecosystem, buying into a franchise that's moving forward, that's growing, that has a robust set of owners, that has people who are committed to that level of growth and isn't stagnant or declining. You want to be on a franchise that's moving forward.
Yeah, and it just depends again on what your goals are. Like there are people that are in a situation where hey, I've got this building sitting here, I need to put something in it. Or hey, I've got this money coming to me. If I invested in the business, I keep it. Otherwise, I got to turn it over to Uncle Sam. Like there's a million different reasons to get into franchising or business ownership, and that's kind of the art of evaluating a franchise, is also understanding those individual contexts that go into it. But it, for any set of circumstances, there's going to be a business that fits with what they're looking to do, as opposed to, something that, well, I just saw somebody on Twitter mention this, so let's look at it and get into it. I'd love to go down that rabbit hole about, what I do as a franchise consultant, and what other people out there are doing as well.
This is the right time to go down that rabbit hole. So you've gotten to the point to where, like you said, you spend most of your time talking to other franchisees or actually working as a franchisee consultant. And so explain to me a little bit what a franchisee consultant is, and are you mostly working with former professional sports players or kind of anybody who's interested, and what do you do? Talk to me about that.
Yeah. So technically we're brokers, I'll say that first. So it's the people I work with, I call them candidates. They're not my clients because they don't pay me anything. I got into it with the goal of helping myself at my lowest moment. As I was going through that career transition, there were some deep valleys. And I was just terrified of what I was going to do next. And I got to the point when I discovered franchising and understood it, and it was like, hey, this is for me. Where I was like, hey, I would have done anything to cross something off my list of what was next for me. So I love that I could do this, and potentially, you don't have to pay me anything, and I could help you cross franchising off the list, or even business ownership after a couple of short phone calls, if that's something people are doing. So I got into this side of things to help myself, to help other transitioning athletes that were as lost as I was. And what I've found is, we've talked about the parallels with the military, way more similarities than dissimilarities there.
Yeah.
And people coming from, the corporate world too. I help people of all kinds. I got into this to help athletes. I mean, obviously that's where my background is. So there's some passion there, but I'm working with people of all backgrounds. But I guess, to that point, how does it work as a consultant broker relationship is I don't get paid by you. A typical franchise fee is around $50,000. So to buy into the business I did, say it's 250, all in investment, 50 of that is a franchise fee. Now, if I would have went to their website, filled out their form, started talking to their people and get into that process, they would keep that $50,000. Now, I was connected to them by a consultant based on fit and what I was looking for. So when I signed, a portion of that franchise fee was then paid to my consulting group on the back end. So it's a finder's fee. It is what it is, and I like that this isn't all I do, and I'm not tied to any one brand, and I'm not in this to get you to sign the dotted line. I'm taking a long-term approach at this. This is a service that I enjoy doing, and I like sleeping good at night. So I like being able to kind of talk more people out of these things than I do into them. And that's a point too. I think, as you know, business ownership is not for everybody. The vast majority of people that are interested in it and look into it, if they see what it really looks like and get a real clear picture, are not going to do it because it requires a pretty big leap. It requires a big bet on yourself. And I like to kind of hit people in the face with that reality of what it looks like to be in there, because I'd rather them not do it than get into it and it go really, really horrible. I mean, not to say that it won't anyway, but my job
But
is
you want
to
to be
make
more
sure.
you want to be more of a fiduciary for that client that you're working with. And
That's right.
one of the great things about, already having your franchise and you're running with it is that you're not, your livelihood isn't reliant on your consulting fees, on your broker
Yeah.
fees. And so that gives, like you said, it gives you the flexibility to diversify your income a little bit. And at the same time, help your prior self and give people actionable advice that that is going to be useful for them, help them see a different path that maybe they didn't see in the past, show them the reality of it, and then say, hey, if this is a good fit for you, then I'm going to help you do it because it worked for me. I think it can work for you. And if it's not, I'm just going to tell you straight up, like, your broker fee, I don't need it. This isn't worth it. It's not worth it to have you sign for something that's not going to be a good fit.
Yeah, and I think what pushed me just farther into this to get me to start posting some things on LinkedIn and stuff is just like you, the way we met is I saw you commenting on just blatant BS that people are putting out there. Well, there's franchise consultants doing the same thing, and that kind of as I understood what was going on more and more, kind of fired me up, right? Because I had a couple candidates that I worked with that had worked with people that are influencers in the space, if you will. And, here's what working with some people in this industry looks like. It's like, hey, you reach out to them, you get a response from their assistant. Their assistant says, hey, yeah, here's a questionnaire, fill it out. And it's really just to financially qualify them. And then from there, they sent them a PDF based on their net worth of 13, 15 one-sheeters for different franchise brands. So hey, look at this menu and select your favorite 3, and we'll connect you to them. And so you didn't actually work with anybody. No one actually guided you on what's the right fit. And then they're connected to them. You're going to Applebee's. You're picking off of a menu and hoping it's going to be a really, really well cooked meal. And then, obviously getting into it, you're getting into that based on the wrong reasons. You're getting into it because, oh, that sounds cool. Or, oh, I see the item 19, the return numbers in their FDD looks attractive. No one's actually working with me and teaching me how to do proper due diligence. They are just doing a numbers game where, well, yeah, I created all this interest on LinkedIn or Twitter or TikTok or whatever it is. So now, if enough of you end up doing it, it's worth it for my bottom line. And some of them, you might talk to them in person a couple times. Others, you don't talk one-on-one with your consultant at all. They host a little group call with everybody that they're, consulting, once a week or so. So it's, again, they're masquerading as an advocate for you, but they're not really advocating for anything other than trying to get you to get to the finish line. And that can look like a lot of different things. Like there's there's a lot of dirty secrets out there in franchising. Franchise attorneys are wonderful. That's something you need. You need somebody to look over it. Yes, these agreements are going to be one-sided. That's the nature of the franchise. They're not going to craft a new agreement just for you. They're hoping to get 300 franchisees on there, and they need that to be a uniform contract. So there's not going to be a whole lot of negotiation, but the value in that is understanding exactly what's in it and what you're signing up for.
Yeah, being very clear on my responsibility as the franchisee.
There is, but like having a lawyer help you understand all of what's in that can help you in this decision. And then if you do it, it'll help you in the future as you make other decisions based on the knowledge you have. And there's franchise attorney, because there's no degree or anything for franchises when it comes to attorneys. It's just something that you can call yourself if you work with people in that. And there's people that their whole existence is based on rubber stamping those deals and getting deals done and not being a roadblock for brokers.
It just gives it another piece of social proof. Like, I've done X thousands of deals in the last couple of years, i.e. I'm an excellent, franchisee attorney. And we see the same thing. And I tell people all the time, one of the key risks, especially in this area of business acquisition, whether you're going to go the franchise route or a more traditional route through the SBA program and buy a non-franchise business, is that it's the Wild West of capitalism. Like, there are no rules down here. Yes, there are laws, but between those very clearly defined laws, which there's not a whole lot of, there's a lot of gray area. One of those being that there's no designation that you have to be a franchise attorney. There's, other than being a lawyer, there's no designation about being a broker. Like, a business broker, anybody can raise their hand and say, I'm a business broker, almost anywhere. Like, sometimes different states have like regulations about having a real estate license or something, but all in all, you have this spectrum from like maybe an 18-year-old who knows nothing, or a 50-year-old who knows nothing for that matter, all the way up to like mid-market investment bankers who are like Series 79 certified. Like, it's a huge spectrum of availability and ability and overall. And then beyond that, it's the Wild West, because you've got experts in the space, such as yourself and such as like other experts you'll see out there who are providing actionable information on quality of earnings or legal advice or, different types of industries to look at. But we're all being screamed at by the influencers who are running up, they're doing their best to run up 20, 40, 100,000 followers on LinkedIn, turning people into like their online communities and, trying to rack up broker fees or course fees or whatever they can get their hands on. And it creates a lot of noise in the space. And so, I can't tell you how many times, and I wish I didn't say this, but I've had dozens of people reach out to me on LinkedIn since August of 2024 with messages that are like, and I quote, I just spent $10,000 on this course and I'm not sure if it's legit. Or I lost my job last week and I think buying a business might be the next best move. And I'm like, and it sucks, because you see people who are desperate, who we all want success and we all want to buy our time back and have that kind of freedom. But that's usually where the influencers step in and they try to prey upon those people as opposed to try to help fix the problem.
Yeah, they're masquerading as an advocate, and they're at times they're just taking advantage, and that it disturbs me. I don't know how you feel about it, and that's kind of why we're both doing what we're doing and trying to be out there. And I'm only an expert to a certain extent in franchising, but what I do when people work with me is I teach them how to do proper due diligence. I'm committed to making sure they get every bit of information that they need, that they invest the right amount of time and take this process seriously, and get as clear a picture as they can to make a monumental decision, a large bet again.
Yeah. I'm glad you put it that way. And, there's a distinction, not everyone should be a business owner or a franchise owner. But there are some people who it's a good fit for you and you just don't know that it's an option. I also have people reach out all the time and they say things like, I'm interested in buying a business. I think it's a good fit for me. I've done some research. I'm still researching and reaching out to people who've done it already. Um, what can I do to set myself apart as a high quality buyer? Like, you know, obviously I need to have like a credit score that can qualify for SBA, but beyond that, what can I do to make myself as qualified as possible? Is there a certain amount of capital I need to have personally, or is it just enough for me to be able to raise enough capital? Is it, like what kind of things should I be thinking about ahead of time? They're going to bode well for me being a good franchise buyer.
Yeah. I think those are the main ones. It's hard to say whether you'd be good or not because it's going to be again brand specific. It's about figuring out what your fit is. There's an exercise that a very wise, very accomplished consultant that I have the utmost respect for that he takes people through, where he has them come up with a mission statement. Every big business has this mission statement, and we all kind of look at it like it's that's whatever. They're just checking a box kind of thing. Well, if you sit down and try to, well, what's Jed's mission statement? Can you get your mission statement down to one or two sentences and define who you are, what you want to be, and where you want to go, and all that? Now, if you can do that, now we have, the way he puts it is now we've got an anchor. You're out on a canoe or a little boat in a lake. You can drop that anchor. That's you. That's your mission statement. So then, you have to have that. And then you start looking at businesses. You start talking to lenders and see what you can afford. And then you start, talking to franchisees. Well, here's what it's going to look like. I'm going to work these hours, this many days a week for X number of years. This is what the pro forma looks like. And you evaluate all that. And then you look down at the water and you kind of figure out where your anchor is. And hey, am I still hovering over that mission statement, or have I moved, far apart from it?
Yeah.
And I think that's the kind of perspective that you need to make those decisions. So you've got to have an anchor first. So you can't, figure out what you can afford, and, what would I be good at? Like those things are all important, but I think you're putting the cart before the horse when you're answering those, because you're going to be miserable and ultimately not do well if you're not hovering right over that anchor. So I think that, I kind of took your question and ran a little different direction with it, but I think it's just, hey, how is this business going to serve me and my purpose, and understanding that. And that's where you start from. And then just going through the process, you're gonna talk to people doing it, and it's gonna make things pretty clear whether you want to be doing that or not. And that's one of the advantages that I like in franchising as opposed to, acquisition, is you get those different perspectives. You get to sit down and ask someone who isn't selling you anything, like, hey, would you do it again? What does a tough day in this business look like? And hey, what my favorite question to have people ask is, gone through all these questions, and then you ask, well, hey, what question that I didn't ask should I be asking as I'm looking into this business? The answers you get from franchisees are, extremely, forthcoming. They are not, whether they're happy or not, they're telling you, right? So you get just an unbelievable amount of information if you put in the time to get it, that you can't get anywhere else. And I've taken people through the process that we're looking at acquiring, a private business, where it's like, hey, I'd be happy to show you some things that are complementary, that you might just see some things or learn some things about the industry, about service businesses in general, that might serve you whether you do this independent business or not. There's just a lot of it. I really like the amount of information you can get from investigating franchises.
Yeah. Well, I really like how you really brought it full circle there. Talking about how, the first thing to really focus on about being a quality buyer isn't the money you bring to bear, which obviously you have to have something because you can't buy broke. It's not so much the tactics. It's going back to where we began. It's by having the mission statement, dropping your anchor, which is exactly what you and your wife did in the very beginning. Hey, what do we want our lives to look like at the end of this? Like lifestyle design from the beginning. And the way you do that, if you're considering franchising, is reaching out to owners of those franchises and saying, hey, tell me about your life. Tell me about your business. Is this something you would do again? What are things, if I'm considering this, what kind of questions should I be asking? And then it's kind of like when I was in the Air Force. We have such clear, defined career paths in the military. Like, you know exactly where you're headed, and not just the next 3, 4. It's 20 years ahead. Like, there's no surprises here, you know. And so, you know, I can look forward. I'm like, all right, well, if I'm going to make it a chief or a colonel, like, I know I can simply look across the hallway and I can see that individual on their day to day. And no, I may not know everything they're going through, but I can see what they're doing, and then I can very easily make an honest assessment. Do I want that life? You know. And this is something I encourage everyone to do, regardless of what career you're in. Look at where those people who are ahead of you are and really ask yourself, is this the life I want to be in? And so, you know, as you're trying to decide what you want your outcome to be, you know, look at how these franchisees, how these franchise owners are living their lives, how involved they are in their businesses, the things they like, the things they don't. And every franchise is going to be different, and figuring out which one, if any of those make sense for you and for your family. That's so good. That's step number one.
Yeah, it's step number one, and without it, you know, it just doesn't. When it doesn't go well, what I see is it going back to that. It's going back to, well, you know, there might be a breakdown in you understanding what you want. There might be a breakdown in the franchise telling you you could get what you want. That's not true. You know, there's all of that in between. But that's you know, that's why we put in the time up front to you know, eliminate as much of those question marks as you can.
Well, Brandon, I really appreciate you coming on. You have definitely illuminated my thinking when it comes to franchisees, because I had no idea. Like, I know some of the basics, but you've definitely helped me get a better grasp of what it means to be a franchisee and the kind of opportunities that are out there for people. And I think more and more, you know, as people have become aware of the idea of business acquisition, you know, franchises are being looked at more. And I think that's for good reason. You know, they're all different quality and different fit, but that doesn't mean you should write them off just because it's a franchise. You should take the time to, you know, educate yourself on the industry and see if it could be a good fit for you, because maybe it is. Maybe, you know, maybe you happen to find something that's the right playbook for you and you're like, man, I could really drive this car fast.
Yeah, it's. I mean, there's no right or wrong answer. You know, there's no steadfast rule. Like, no, only private or only franchise. Like, you know, I love both. I think that, you know, and I've worked with people that have been looking to acquire businesses for years. You know, and it's not easy. Like, the unicorns just aren't out there. And you know, anybody that's been at that, you know, looking for businesses for a couple of years, and you know, what does it hurt to look at some franchises? Doesn't mean you're going to do it, right? That's the other thing I like about this. I like not taking anybody's money, being able to provide something of value or some insight there. So it's you know, it's worth looking at for the right person, for sure.
Well, Brandon, again, thanks for your insights. For the listeners out there who are interested in learning more about franchising, what's the best way that they can find you and get in touch with you?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn. You know, I've got my my email up there, and then I've got a website called What's Next Franchising. You know, you can fill out a form on there, or book some time to talk to me, and you'll be talking to me. You know, I like being able to say that, and I'm gonna keep my schedule to where I can uphold it. But yeah, reach out. I'd be happy to chat with anybody.
Okay, well, great. Thanks again, Brandon. Loved having you here. Really helped me learn a lot about franchising, and we're probably going to have you back again so we can dive even deeper on some of the ins and outs of the day-to-day life of being a franchise operator.
Yeah, anytime, Jed. Thanks for having me.
All right, thanks.